Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
Some campaigners sent me a dossier. It was about 80 pages of people calling for the McCanns to be tortured, people offering to kill them, all sorts of dreadful things. There were Photoshop pictures that showed them counting tables full of money.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
In the last two episodes, we've explored the various police investigations into Madeleine McCann's disappearance from a holiday apartment in Portugal in 2007 and talked about the current lead suspect, convicted German rapist Christian Bruckner. 17 years on, we still have no idea what happened to 3-year-old Madeleine, and the case remains unsolved. And into that void has come a glut of speculation and conspiracy theories in parallel with the explosion of social media during the same period. So in this final episode on Madeleine McCann, Martin and I will explore how crime has morphed from something investigated by police and covered by journalists to a social media phenomenon. We'll look at the rise of true crime amateur sleuths, how they've impacted the McCann case and those involved in it, and in some crimes brought with them abuse, lawsuits, and tragedy. Martin, as if this case couldn't be more heartbreaking, the seeming disappearance into thin air of a little girl nearing her 4th birthday from a holiday apartment in Portugal, social media seems to have made it even darker.
Almost from the moment that Madeleine disappeared, the case seemed to launch what I've called in the past a torrent of bile or a flood of vitriol. And it's no different today. The McCanns were arrested as suspects, we know that. And even though they were ruled out by the Portuguese police and Scotland Yard, found no evidence of their involvement in Madeleine's disappearance, they continue to be what I'm sure are the most vilified couple ever on social media. I mean, social media was in its infancy at around this time. Routinely, they are subject to threats, accusations by anonymous internet trolls, people who hide behind the anonymity that social media gives them. And it gives them, of course, a platform to air their views, and they're not constrained by fear of being identified. For many years, the story of their vilification online was untold. I was aware of it occasionally, but I had no conception of quite how bad it was. And so there came a point when I did tell that story. And one of the people antagonising the McCanns online, as a result of my story, took her own life. It's not an easy thing to discuss, but it emphasised to me the responsibilities as a journalist that we all have, but I still believe that it was an important story to tell.
I know from working with you for many years at Sky News how seriously you take stories, how much you care about victims, how you nurture and look after your contacts, and you always do the right thing. So I can imagine just how difficult that would have been for you. Before we go into more detail, let's look at how that story started and go back to the beginning. How did the antagonism start to build?
Well, as we've explored in the earlier episodes, nobody really cared much for Kate McCann and Gerry McCann from the very start. And I think the thing more than anything that shaped that initial concern that grew to hatred of Madeleine's parents was the idea that they had left their children alone in the apartment while they were dining with their friends nearby. And that accusation of child neglect, if you like, has always hung over them. In fact, there are an awful lot of people, particularly in Portugal, who said they should have been prosecuted for child neglect. And it is something that the Portuguese criminal justice system does take very seriously. People are charged with abandoning, in that sense, their children, even for a few hours. I think there might have been some social envy involved too. The McCanns are middle-class doctors, articulate, but rather distant when people have seen them interviewed on TV. They often come across as rather cold, and I think one of the reasons for that is, as we know, they're both doctors. They are used to delivering bad news. They're used to hiding their own emotions and delivering that bad news in perhaps a very matter-of-fact way. And I think they were probably capable of adopting that attitude, even when talking about their own missing daughter. And I think a lot of people don't really understand what was going on. And of course, people say, well, they don't cry very much. We've never seen them shed a tear. Well, people who see them and listen to them on TV and radio are really seeing the McCanns for a fraction of 1% of their lives. Who knows what emotions they go through in their private lives?
I remember interviewing Jerry and Kate McCann a number of times over the years, and we often commented in the office that they did come across in person as quite cold. There was a fragility about Kate, but also I always wanted to consider the amount of shock that they're in. There's two parents who have lost their little girl, and who knows, God forbid we walk in those footsteps, how we may have reacted. And as Jim Gamble, the guest we interviewed in our last episode, said, and you've alluded to, Jerry is a heart surgeon, and they're built differently to us, aren't they, perhaps?
They are. And I think for a lot of people, they just saw a couple who put together a slick publicity operation, a middle-class family who perhaps didn't have to worry too much about money. I mean, they were given lots of money by supporters, particularly in that period of 3 years when there wasn't a police investigation. They funded their own private investigators to keep the story of their missing daughter alive and in the public eye. They set up a not-for-profit company to manage that. There were lots of public donations. A slick PR representative, Clarence Mitchell, who for several years worked for them as a government employee and then gave up his job to work for them personally. And of course, they pursued an expensive libel suit, first against Portuguese newspaper and then against various newspapers in Fleet Street and ultimately against Leicestershire Police, who they accused as their local force of not keeping them informed of what was going on in the police investigation in Portugal. And of course, more than that, they engaged in a decade-long legal battle over libel against Gonçalo Amaral. He was the original Portuguese police investigator. He was eventually disgraced and taken off the case, but before he did that, he was the one that came up with this theory that the McCanns had fabricated the idea of their daughter being abducted because she had died accidentally in the apartment, and they had spirited away and got rid of her body. The fact that the McCanns had left the children alone, that was established. The McCanns couldn't argue that. They said that they'd made a terrible mistake. On top of that, the suspicion officially from the Portuguese police just fueled some concern about the McCanns' behaviour that grew eventually into hatred. So the McCanns pursued Gonçalo Amaral over a book he eventually wrote after he'd left the police force, in which he laid out this theory that Madeleine had died accidentally and they had covered up her death and got rid of her body and fabricated the idea that she had been abducted.
And the long-running lawsuit with him drew ever more public attention to the book and the case.
It did. It went on for a very long time. The reason why they sued Gonçalo Amaral for the book was that he was suggesting very clearly that they were complicit in Madeleine's disappearance, and they felt, particularly during those 3 years when there was no official police investigation, that the people who read the book, and they read it in droves, thousands and thousands of copies were sold, that people would be discouraged from looking for Madeleine. And the McCanns just wanted to keep the story of her disappearance in the media spotlight so that people would look out for her. So they pursued Gonçalo Amaral. They eventually won, in the first round of court hearings, €500,000. But it backfired because people then accused them of simply being in it for the money. And they tried to argue that, no, this was all about maintaining people's interest in her disappearance and them continuing, potential witnesses continuing to look for her. That court case went on right up until 2022, when the final hearing at a European court backed Gonzalo Amaral. But what it did was to show me that when I did a report on that final ruling, that the hatred against the McCanns was still there. And when I posted my report on YouTube, it generated hundreds of comments criticising the couple, more speculation, more damning of them. I thought it had fizzled out, but that just showed me that it was as strong as it had ever been.
And what other factors, Martin, fueled that social media frenzy and the hatred you talk of?
So we had the idea that people thought they were wrong to have left their children alone that night, something that the McCanns have acknowledged. Then you had the Portuguese police officially accusing them of fabricating the idea that Madeleine had been abducted, that she died during an accident and they'd covered up what had happened and got rid of her body. But then 15 months after Madeleine disappeared, the Portuguese police shelved their investigation. So in July 2008, they said, we can't take this any further. But bizarrely, given the secrecy around the police investigation up to that point and the reluctance of Portuguese police to discuss publicly what they were up to and how their investigation was going, they then put thousands of pages, the details of their investigation, online so anybody could read it. And of course, there were contradictions in the investigation, and it showed up particularly that the McCanns had refused to answer lots of questions when they were arrested. It threw up the controversy of, was the window of Madeleine's bedroom open or closed? How had an abductor got in or got out? The idea that the two younger children had slept through the commotion and the chaos of that first night when Madeleine disappeared suggested to people that perhaps they'd been drugged and perhaps Madeleine had been drugged, in the sense that perhaps they'd had difficulty sleeping and they'd been given Calpol or something like that to help them sleep. We all give our kids Calpol. They have colds, they have toothache. We give our kids sleeping sedatives of that kind to help them get a good night's sleep. The accusation was that the McCanns had drugged their children so that they could go out and have an uninterrupted 2 or 3 hours dining before they came home and went back to bed themselves.
The McCanns, over the years, didn't really ingratiate themselves with the press or the police. I think Jim Gamble's report for the government actually said they fell out with everyone. Why do you think that was? Perhaps some jealousy, obviously, that thought that you wouldn't leave an expensive watch on a bed and go out for dinner, but they'd left their children, so a lot of people felt like that at the time. But they really didn't seem to get on with anyone, did they?
No, I think originally they just felt that the Portuguese police were not doing enough to find Madeleine. And I think there was that slow start to the investigation. The local police who came and said, well, she's probably wandered off, we'll start the search. And I think people can understand the attitude of those local police. I mean, they weren't geared up to immediately assume the worst. I mean, I think these days, certainly in the UK, that assumption will always be made. If a child's gone missing, let's assume the worst, seal the scene, start the forensic search, seal the borders to Spain. None of that was done initially, and the McCanns felt that there simply weren't enough police officers searching for Madeleine. And they also complained very early on about the British police involvement. So Leicestershire Police, who kind of oversaw the British response to this, sent family liaison officers to look after the McCanns in a sense. Well, they were strong-minded people. They didn't need to be cuddled by British police officers. I think that was the sense. And they said, don't send us family liaison officers, send us detectives, send us more detectives. So I think there was initially that feeling amongst the McCanns that the police weren't doing enough. And there was an overheard conversation at the police station when they were first being interviewed as witnesses. In the first 48 hours, the British consul had turned up and he was overheard on the phone by the Portuguese police saying that the detectives weren't doing anything to help the McCanns. So that kind of sowed the seed of some resentment amongst the Portuguese investigators that perhaps began to colour that sense of us and them, and soured perhaps initially the relationship between the Portuguese police investigators and the McCanns.
It's strange to think that back in 2007, when Madeleine disappeared, social media was, as you said, in its infancy, was nothing like it's become today. This case really straddles the boom, doesn't it, in social media?
Yes, I mean, without the emergence of social media in those years, I'm sure none of this hatred it wouldn't be anything like as widely broadcast as it has been. But social media, Twitter particularly, was born around that time, and it gave people an anonymous platform to say what they like. And as it grew and more people joined that platform, conspiracy theories emerged, and people continued to discuss with like-minded people what had really happened in their minds to Madeleine, and it just grew and grew and grew.
And a few years after Madeleine disappeared, you started to report on how the case was being discussed on social media.
In 2014, so 7 years after Madeleine disappeared, some campaigners sent me a dossier. It was about 80 pages of the online abuse. I mean, some extraordinary examples of people calling for the McCanns to be tortured, people offering to kill them, all sorts of dreadful things. There were Photoshop pictures that showed them counting tables full of money. This was all over Twitter, Facebook, and in online chat rooms and forums. There were many forums that were dedicated to the McCann case. Many people attacked the activities of the Madeleine Fund, which the McCanns had set up to publicise the need to keep searching for Madeleine. But of course, it attracted an awful lot of money from private individuals. But beyond that, there was even more worrying things, examples, evidence of Kate McCann particularly being stalked. Somebody had posted that she'd just seen her in the high street in the village in Leicestershire where they lived. Somebody talking about her being in the gym. I mean, really intrusive stuff. There were photographs of Madeleine's twin siblings, Sean and Amelie, who were pictured in one famous incident with their parents watching the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow. There was another episode where somebody had posted a picture of the family sitting in a motorway restaurant, and it said, "This is where they are now. This is the address. This is the restaurant where you can find them. Why don't people go along? Go and spit in their food. Go and make them feel very uncomfortable." It was extraordinary, the level of abuse that was still being aimed at the McCanns. And this was 7 years after Madeleine had disappeared. In addition to co-hosting True Criminals, Helen hosts her own award-winning podcast, The Convex Conversation. If you're eager to learn more about the inspiring guests she interviews, from royalty to astronauts, from industry leaders to explorers, check it out at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to yours.
And if you're curious to dive deeper into Martin's work as a crime reporter, I had the pleasure of interviewing him about his book, No One Got Cracked Over the Head for No Reason, Dispatches from a Crime Reporter, on my podcast. In this episode, Martin shares some gripping stories that resonate with the themes we explore here on True Criminals. You can find links to that episode in our show notes or on the True Criminals page at audiobleachglobal.com.
You know him as a British bulldog and World War II hero, but who was the real Winston Churchill? New history podcast Creating Churchill explores the man behind the myth, how Churchill's life and legacy were shaped by relationships with tricky allies like Roosevelt and Stalin, enemies including Hitler and Gandhi, and his wife and most devoted critic, Clemmy. With fresh psychological insight and untold stories, Creating Churchill, available now on your favourite podcast app.
I didn't realise it was as bad as that. I mean, that dossier was also sent to the Met Police, and Jim Gamble, the former head of CEOP, who we spoke to in our last episode, described the thousands of attacks as a legacy of bile that would always impact Madeleine's siblings. He believed that the Met should investigate. Did they investigate?
No, they didn't. This was one of the reasons why I was sent the dossier. The campaigners, who really had an awful lot of sympathy for the McCanns, but they weren't making judgments about whether the McCanns had been involved or not. They just felt that the level of vitriol was so much that it could turn into something actually physical. And they feared for the McCanns. They felt they were in danger, potential danger, from a physical attack. They'd sent the dossier to the Metropolitan Police, but the Metropolitan Police had done nothing with it. They felt that it should be investigated by Leicestershire Police, which was the McCann's local force, at which point I was sent the dossier because the campaigners felt that it wasn't getting the attention that it needed. Leicestershire Police did eventually investigate it, but before then, I managed to identify some of these anonymous trolls. Most of them were successfully hiding behind their anonymity, but occasionally one or two gave clues to their true identity. And I drove to Burton Overy in Leicestershire, not far from where the McCanns were living. And I confronted a woman called Brenda Leyland. She was a 63-year-old divorcee, and she had been tweeting that she wanted the couple to suffer for the rest of their miserable lives, and other more damning things. She was clearly a McCann hater, as these people became known to the McCann sympathisers. So my cameraman and I waited outside her house. I was careful not to be too intrusive, so I didn't go banging on her door to confront her. I thought better to try and talk to her when she came out, which she did, and we filmed an exchange that lasted 46 seconds. She wasn't running away from me. She came up and talked to me. She was about to get into a car, but she came back after I identified who I was. She came back and listened to what I was saying, and I simply was asking her why she felt so awful towards the McCanns, and I asked her about her Twitter account. Why was she trolling the McCanns? She said, more or less, she was entitled to do that. And I said that her actions and those of the other trolls had been reported to the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, which seemed to come as a bit of a shock to her, although she said she wasn't concerned. And then she just turned and got into her friend's car. She'd come to pick her up and they drove off. I stayed around compiling my report, and I was on the point of leaving when, after about 2 hours, she came back. And she invited me in for tea, and she didn't strike me as somebody who was overly concerned about what I was planning to do in my report. So we talked for about half an hour, and we laughed about her cat and the cats that I had at home, although she didn't want to record a formal interview.
So this wasn't on camera, this was you going in for a cup of tea and an informal chat?
Yeah, she clearly gave me the impression that she was happy to talk to me and try to understand my concerns and what I felt would be the concerns of our viewers. She listened to what I had said, and she gave me some answers. She said she was entitled to have her thoughts. I mean, that's fair enough. Of course people are. But the point I was making was that she was spreading some real vitriol about the McCanns, and I felt she really wasn't justified. And some of the things she thought that they had done or hadn't done, I was able to explain to her, well, this isn't true, and you're wrong about this, and so forth. So I finished the conversation. We left on very good terms, and I promised to keep in touch with her and tell her what exactly I was doing with my report and when it would be published.
So what happened next?
I had a number of phone call conversations with her. She said that she wouldn't tweet again. And she said at one point that, and I thought she was joking, that I had ruined her life. But she said it in a very light-hearted way, almost with a laugh. And the next day, she called me again to ask if she was going to be identified in the report. And we, editorially, had already decided not to name her or show where she lived. But I said we would show her on camera in that initial encounter where she did talk to me before she went off in the car. The day after that, we spoke again, and she said to me, in what I took as a throwaway line, that she had thought about ending it all, but I'm feeling better, she said. I thought it was a throwaway remark. On the 2nd of October, we ran the report on Sky News. The next day, Jerry McCann happened to be on the BBC's Today programme and was asked about my report and Brenda Leyland's tweets. And he didn't talk about it directly, but he said that he was worried about his 2 children and what they'd seen on the internet as they grew up. And he said that people like her, trolls, if you like, needed to be made examples of because they were causing damage. 2 days later, Brenda Leyland was found dead, and she'd killed herself in a hotel in Leicester. after deleting her Twitter account.
Martin, that's such a terrible end, and I can't imagine how horrible that must have been for you finding out. How did you feel and react at the time?
Well, nothing has changed in the way I felt about it. I was, and I still am, devastated by what happened, by her death. The enormity of what happened will always be with me, to the extent that I wish I'd never done the story. I thought it was an important story to do, and I suppose I still feel that it was an issue that was worth exposing, but no report is worth anybody's death. That's obvious, isn't it? The inquest, I gave evidence at the inquest, revealed some stuff that I didn't know, that Brenda Leyland had suffered from mental illness and had attempted suicide before. I had no idea of that, and if I had tried to explore her medical background, I'd have been castigated for that. Her son spoke about her death, and he said that my report, the Sky News report, exposing her had been the final straw.
Oh, that's just awful. What happened in the aftermath of all that?
Well, I got trolled, nothing to the extent the McCanns had suffered. Brenda Leyland, after her death, was trolled too by people who didn't agree with what she'd been saying on social media. I was accused of murder. There was a Facebook campaign to get me fired. I was subject to the same kind of volley of internet abuse. And I guess when people listen to this podcast, there'll be some people who will continue to castigate me and blame me for Brenda Leyland's death. But the thing that encourages me to keep on as a journalist is that at the end of the inquest, the coroner said that we had done everything as would be expected. I had engaged Brenda Leyland. I had kept her informed about what we were doing. I couldn't be held responsible for the actions that she took. And I sometimes wonder how I was able to do that. And I think, on reflection, that I have some integrity as a journalist, and I think that kicked in perhaps subconsciously in my dealings with Brenda Leyland. But no story is worth the death of anybody, and I wish I'd not done the story.
You have a lot of integrity as a journalist, and it's an awful situation to be in. And I can see also, though, why you were trying to expose some of the hatred that was going on to the McCanns and people who hide in dark corners from the safety of social media. There's so much hate on social media. Very difficult for you, Martin. Have the police taken any action over the years against the trolls?
No, they haven't. And I find that extraordinary because I've covered internet trolls on other stories where footballers, particularly people from ethnic backgrounds, have been trolled. One message of hate that has led to somebody being arrested and in some cases charged. There was a young man who had abused a teacher who was murdered by a pupil in Leeds after her death. He'd posted stuff about this teacher, horrible hatred about this teacher after she had died. So there was no way, of course, that she would have read it. Yet he was arrested, charged and jailed. So given the level of vitriol that these campaigners had unearthed and that I exposed on Sky News, it seemed inevitable that somebody would be identified and held to account. But it didn't happen. Leicestershire Police, who were passed the folder of evidence by the Metropolitan Police, spent 6 months investigating it, and at the end of it announced it would take no further action. And they refused to do an interview with me. They put out a statement that said that the material, yes, was distasteful and unpleasant. Well, it was far more than that. But they felt that it hadn't constituted a prosecutable offence. And I thought that was bizarre, and police officers I spoke to also thought it was a strange decision. And I think more than anything, I wondered whether it perhaps reflected that poor relationship between the McCanns and their local force. Was this the force, in a way, getting their own back for the McCanns' resentment early on about the liaison officers that Leicestershire Police sent them? And of course, the McCanns had started to sue the Leicestershire Police within a few months because they felt Leicestershire Police weren't telling them what was going on in the Portuguese police investigation. So was this Leicestershire Police getting their own back? It seems extraordinary that nobody was even interviewed or arrested or questioned about the trolling of the McCanns.
17 years on, there's new evidence, a German suspect. Does the abuse still continue?
It does. Perhaps not at the same level, but any of us can Google the McCanns and you won't have to look through the stories for very long to find somebody promoting the usual conspiracy theories, accusing the McCanns of involvement in their daughter's disappearance. And it's difficult to foresee a time when people will get tired of doing it. And of course, every time the story comes up again, it just fuels that hatred online. And I suppose the recent trial of the McCann suspect, Christian Bruckner, has given people another opportunity to promote their thoughts on what they see as the real issue of Madeleine's disappearance.
I think one thing I find quite extraordinary, Martin, is that now mainstream media follows social media when a big case breaks. And we've had all sorts of examples, haven't we, of people becoming armchair detectives thinking they can find a missing person or getting involved in a case.
Well, the internet is a brilliant thing, isn't it? It's extraordinary to think how much information you can find. And it's true, as journalists, mainstream journalists, we do get ideas for stories from social media. I guess it's no surprise because witnesses to a crime, particularly in my world, witnesses to a crime will post what they've just seen. And I remember very early on in the emergence of Twitter, spending an hour in the studio talking about what looked like a kidnap and a shooting in Sunningdale. And all I had to rely on were the tweets from people who said that they had witnessed this kidnap and there was a body on the side of the road. And I was very careful to attribute it to people who were posting things on Twitter. When 2 hours later, Thames Valley Police finally agreed to tell us something about what had happened, those tweeters proved to be rather accurate in what had happened. There had been a kidnap, there had been a shooting or a murder. So it gave me the idea that there are terrible things on the internet, but there are some good things that journalists can harness and use as a base for a genuine news story.
What about the disappearance of Nicola Bulley in Lancashire last year? I remember there was a lot of talk about people getting involved on social media with what had happened to her.
Yes, well, this case of Nicola Bulley, the woman who disappeared into the river in Lancashire, really put the spotlight on internet armchair detectives. And I met some of them, people wandering along the riverbank, particularly as the days went on and there was no sign of Nicola Bulley. People who had their own theories about what had happened and even talking about potential suspects for a crime that may have been committed. In the end, of course, the deduction was that she had simply fallen into the river and drowned. But for those 2 weeks when police were still looking for her body, it was a story that attracted dozens and dozens of people to the riverside who wandered up and down, taking pictures, taking videos, posting them online, and giving their idea of what they thought had happened. And the police said at the time, Lancashire police said, it became a huge distraction to them and, of course, may have dissuaded potential witnesses from coming forward and giving vital information.
It makes you wonder what's going on. Does it show that perhaps people's faith in institutions like the police and the media that once were trusted to solve and cover crime is perhaps breaking down, or is it something else?
It's difficult to know exactly what's going on. Certainly today, the public confidence in policing is at an all-time low, and there are lots of reasons for that, particularly cases like Wayne Couzens in the Metropolitan Police, who abducted, raped and murdered Sarah Everard. And that gave policing a very, very bad name. The idea that there were people like that who've been given a warrant card, who have the power of arrest over us. Now, that's a very rare example, but there are other examples. And there were several cases that came together in the past 2 or 3 years that really put the focus on the bad apples in policing, and it gave policing in general a bad reputation. And some of those police forces, particularly the Met, are trying to recover from that poor public image. I think police are still making great inroads in solving cases. I don't think that it illustrates really terrible things about policing. And for every bad criminal police officer, there are thousands more who are dedicated, who are doing great jobs. But I suppose it's those few cases of dreadful behaviour that get the spotlight, and of course, because we have social media now, perhaps are given a bigger spotlight.
We've explored over 3 episodes an incredible amount of detail, a lot of detail I didn't know, and I've covered and followed some of the Madeleine McCann case myself as a journalist. I don't think this is the end of it. I think there may well be a 4th episode in 2025 that takes us location-wise to Germany. Do you think that might be a possibility?
I think it's more of a possibility. I think the German authorities are determined to charge Christian Bruckner over Madeleine's disappearance. We know that they have a compelling circumstantial case. We know that they are continuing to search for forensic evidence. They may get it, they may not. They have to decide sometime in the next few months, because Christian Bruckner will be released from the sentence that he's serving for rape sometime next year. So the clock is ticking. And my gut feeling is that the Germans will go ahead with a prosecution. They perhaps will do it without having as much evidence as they would prefer. But I think more than anything, the German authorities want to show the world that they can succeed in solving one of the world's great mysteries where the Portuguese police and, more importantly, Scotland Yard failed.
And just a final personal thought from you, Martin. We asked Jim Gamble what the story meant to him, and he said that there'll always be a Madeleine flame in his heart, and he hopes that at some point there'll be some resolution. You followed this case and covered it from day one. You're a father yourself, you're a grandfather. How much would it mean to you to get some kind of resolution and some answers for the family?
I'd love to find out what happened to Madeleine McCann. I've spent 17 years covering it. Every year I've done stories and monitored the developments in the police investigations, the various police investigations, the arrest of suspects, the release of suspects. And of course, for the last 4 years, I've reported a lot on the current investigation, in which there appears to be a compelling suspect. But I'm not convinced that even if Christian Bruckner is charged, that he will get convicted. I'm in the twilight of my career. There are lots of stories that have come and gone, and I've seen resolutions in lots of them. I suppose more than any story, I would like to see the end of this story. But it's not about me. It's about Madeleine's parents. For their sake, I would like to get the answer to what exactly happened. And even the McCanns themselves, I think, have acknowledged, while they cling to the hope that they might still find Madeleine alive, I think in their hearts they must know that the reality is that most likely she isn't alive. But I think knowing that for certain would bring them some kind of comfort.
And some comfort, presumably, for her younger siblings too.
Yes, you can only imagine what the parents have said to the siblings, Sean and Amelie, who were 18 months when Madeleine disappeared, probably have no memory of their older sister, but will, of course, have been told the circumstances of her disappearance. I'm sure the parents keep them up to speed on what's happening in terms of developments of the investigation. And I read some time ago that Madeleine's bedroom is kept very much as it was when the family left for that holiday in Portugal. I'm sure each day the twins, Sean and Amelie, have reminders of their missing sister. And I'm sure, like their parents, will cling to the hope that one day they might find Madeleine alive.
Hey listeners, True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.